Greetings. This is Bradford Donald Keller Townsend, and this is a Reality Club book report. The title of the book is Progress Debunked. The author is Samuel W. Thomsen. Additional title: The Creation, Destruction, Balance, and Ancient Wisdom's Primacy. The author is a graduate of Caltech University Honors Program in Physics and has 2 master's degrees in philosophy from the University of Pittsburgh. He is a Christian, and the publisher is Poise Press, and the logo is a hypothetical perpetual motion machine. Karma is the cycle of cause and effect. What happens to a person happens because they caused it with their actions. It also goes on to the complexity theory, chaos theory, that things in life can get so complicated and complex that there's unintended consequences. And then in Asia, there's the concept of dharma. That's cosmic law and order phenomena. It has many definitions, depend on the context and time period. In Hinduism, dharma, dhamma, is duty, virtue, morality, religion, righteousness, Rita. And excuse me if I don't speak any Asian languages if I mispronounce those. When he talks about the ancient wisdom's primacy, he's talking about Judaism, Christianity, and he's a professed Christian, Islam and the Quran, Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, Confucianism, all these ancient sources of wisdom. And he thinks that in this technological age, he found and went through a lot of what I did in that spending years studying at university. You looked up at science as being the pinnacle of human achievement, and then all you find out is you memorize recipes for specific special situations that's similar to baking and icing a chocolate cake. You can't put the icing on the cake before you put it in the oven to cook it. You can put the flour in the bowl first, or you could have put the egg in, but there's a certain order, and that's called an algorithm in computer programming. And that's really what you learn, whether it's quantum mechanics, general relativity, special relativity, Newtonian mechanics, which is 99% of engineering here on Earth, the laws of thermodynamics, all kinds of specialty rules having to do with how fluids flow through pipes, and statistical mechanics of circulation of particles in astronomical quantities through an office building or a government building when you're engineering it, theoretically. So what he's exactly what H.G. Wells predicted. I've made previous videos about irrationality, nonsense, and people believing in extraterrestrial aliens, abductions, angels coming to the battlefield in the Middle East and catching bullets and fragments for soldiers, or making soldiers invisible, or bullets flying everywhere and nobody getting hit, type of thing. So there's all this superstitions and irrationality, and at the end of the mechanical industrial age, which, because the materials to make the machinery, the metals, and the fuel to power them are of finite quantity and cannot be recycled. Some of them are non-renewable resources, and steel, sublimates, and it also rusts, oxidizes, which means giving up electrons. So when you use iron ore and you put it in a smelter and you make steel, you can recycle that, but you'll only get a portion of the steel back. And a lot of materials cannot be recycled because they're in things like tiny motherboards for smart devices, tablets, phones, all kinds of uses, engine blocks. It would take too much energy and labor to get to those metals and materials, so they're not recycled and lost. So we're on a finite planet, 40,000 kilometers in circumference, this sphere, and the economically or energy, where the energy required to get the metal or get the fuel is a profitable energy investment. You can't keep putting energy into energy sinks. Eventually, you just run out of energy, and then you're just down to muscle power and wood. And wood and cellulose or other type of plant power is going to be in short supply with so many people to feed and so much land under cultivation. Having trees to cut down, you're not going to want to cut down your apple, your pear trees, your olive trees that give you quality nutrition as food. And with so many people, what remaining forests are left, are quickly being cut down. So he talks about Malthus, who he in some ways puts above Darwin, and that Malthus talked about constraints to human population, that human population, based on the technology of the time, always hovers, so that there's always a starving margin. That's the way all animals are, whether it be squirrels, deer, humans, whales. They always procreate to the margins, where there's always a certain percentage of the population malnourished and starving to death. And through natural selection and environmental pressures, they adapt. And most species do not adapt and go extinct. So if you have 1,000 species, maybe only one will survive, and then all the others will go extinct, and then they'll use whatever resources are there. It could be energy from the sun, or eating microorganisms in the ocean or in a pond. So that the idea of constraints, and that Malthus did not mean to be cruel to the poor. He is just saying that's the natural, logical reality, is that even if your people, let's say you're like the Phoenicians or the Greeks, and you choose not to have children and to practice infanticide and don't value large families, it only takes one tribe in the world, one culture, then they'll eventually take over. And you can see a living example of this in the United States and Israel. In Israel, the ultra-Orthodox Jews average over 5 children per marriage, where the atheist secular Jews, who still identify as Jews but declare themselves as being atheists, and they think of homosexuality's a legitimate lifestyle and all that, they average only 1.5 children. And women, progressive liberal Jews, atheist women, I think they're even below 1 child average. So they always have to, if you're a liberal, neoliberal economic, social justice warrior, liberal Jewish woman, since you choose not to have children yourself, you always have to try to get the Orthodox woman who's married to a devout religious man who has 7 children, to try to get one of their 7 children, or one of their female daughters, obviously, to convert over to your progressive ideology away from Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, because you're not procreating yourself. And you say you're scientists, but in science, it's the strongest deer fights duels with the other deer and they smash their antlers together, or rams, smash into each other, and the one who's the strongest gets to mate with the females. That's the way nature works. It's so the successful civilizations, and he counts Islam as being successful. People are willing to endure suffering and hardship to procreate. And instead of having a luxurious lifestyle, they're willing to have a marginal, even a malnourished lifestyle, but to procreate. They choose procreation and family and survival over luxury and comfort. And in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox Jews are demographically went from seem inconsequential, just little novelty that you could put over there like in a zoo, and then with their long beards and their knots hanging from their waist with their 613 commandments on it, and their long hair and their black suits and their funny white socks and hats and everything. Well, they went from just being like a tourist attraction for Jews and Catholics and such that went to visit the Holy Land. Now they're up to like 20% of the population from 1% because they're multiplying so fast. The same thing's happening with the Amish in the United States. There was like 1,500 of them not that long ago, and now they've hit the over 1 million mark. And German is actually one of the fastest, because of them, one of the fastest growing languages spoken in the home in America, because of the Hutterites and the Mennonites and the communities in Canada, United States, and Mexico are growing. They're still having over 6 children average family size, which means that there'll be 3 million Amish in 20 years instead of 1 million. That's starting to get into significant numbers. And with the depopulation of rural America, they're leaving a lot of small farms are being abandoned because people don't want to live out in the rural areas where it's hard to get access to internet and that type of thing, and where the Amish can come in and buy that inexpensive land. And some of them are turning to better farming methods of permaculture and improving their situation. So, Darwin also, he talks about cultural Darwinism, that the reason Christianity is the biggest religion with over 2,200,000,000 adherents is it must be doing something right to have survived all the twists and turns of the last 1,800 to 2,000 years. And the same with Islam, surviving over 1,000 years and still expanding. Their numbers are growing, not shrinking, of devout Muslims. They must be doing something right. And that's what Simon Pierre Laplace, the great astronomer mathematician, said that during the Napoleon French Revolution extremes, don't throw out the religion. It took thousands of years to develop into this, and it's there for a purpose. Even if we don't understand it, we haven't taken the time to look at the positive aspects of the religion and what it's doing for us. So even he went through the process of, you learn science, you find it wanting and vacuous, and it's all the different laws of physics conflict with each other. Like, we're supposed to be going 490,000 miles per hour around the great attractor of the Milky Way. But if we were, the centripetal, centrifugal forces of accelerating, because we're going around in more or less a perfect circle, would be flinging us, out, and just law after law of physics breaks down and doesn't work if you don't have it just in its right little box and little special situations. So if you spend your time working 80-hour plus weeks like he did, he probably studied really hard in high school and took advanced placement exams to test out a calculus and first year physics and that type of thing. That's what it takes to get into these really elite selective schools. Instead of, I presume, being an athlete, he would spend hours in his room studying and taught himself a lot of math and physics before he even went there. And that's probably how he got such high marks, is he self-taught himself the math and the physics, because you can just buy the books, online and work through them, and they have solution manuals, and memorize the algorithms and all the different kind of problem sets, and then learn them, and then the theory behind them, and then get really high marks and accolades while you're a student. So then he switched over to philosophy of science, then classical philosophy is where he is. So when I was his age, I'm older than he is, I've kind of gone through the same phases, and he's just what H.G. Wells said would happen in anticipations. You have the irrational UFO cults where people are committing suicide and castrating themselves, and people have been doing those kind of things for thousands of years, castrating themselves, throwing themselves into fires, having big orgies, uh, doing human sacrifice. That goes on today, and it's always gone on, and there's always been that component of a civilization, or even what you wouldn't call just irrational, nutty behavior. And then he said there would be the mechanic, engineer, clerk class, and the mechanic is the people who fix like diesel tractor trailers, harvester combines. They need people who can go in there and keep the harvesters operating so they can scoop up tons and tons of maize and rice or whatever they're harvesting. And so there's these people that are taught cause and effect. They learn algebra, they learn Newtonian mechanics, hydrodynamics, and basics, thermodynamics. They don't get through calculus, but they kind of think cause and effect, rational type people. Then you have the engineers, which he is. It's kind of at the pinnacle of that, the elite class of what I'll call the mechanic engineer class. So it goes mechanic, technician, engineer. That these type of people would have traditional family values for the most part, and they would see they take basic biology in high school or a biology course in college, or they just watch because they're like science. They watch animal documentaries, and they see how nature, or they go hiking and camping and see how nature actually is instead. And they there is going to be a cohort of people that go nutso, um, where you have heiresses and rentiers with their vast fortunes and trust funds funding these tripped out cults. You're going to have very rational, kind of right brain people who want to get married and have 5 children and be the manager of a factory. or be head of a team of software engineers where they get highly paid, and then they have strong family values. Not everybody is going to go wacko, and so for him, he's really going through all the texts of Lao Tzu, the Chinese, Confucius, the Hindu Veda texts, all the Greeks, and Romans, and even looking at the pagan religions, just trying to find out what wisdom was there of all these ancient peoples, because he's found science wanting, and then philosophy, modern philosophy, to be vacuous and kind of stupid and retarded, and a lot inconsistent and of no helpful use, just kind of a nihilistic blah, and then he says, well, at least some of the previous philosophers had practical purposes behind them, and makes a case, for why he is both, considers himself 100% a physicist, 100% a philosopher, and 100% a Christian, and that they all can be logically congruent with one another, and that the progressive agenda of having no children, and feeding all the poor, and having that whole agenda is bound to fail and goes against the laws of biology and evolution, and that we're heading toward the end of mechanical civilization, and we're going back to wind, wood, and blood and muscle power. Um, people are going to start riding buggies with horses again and having to grow their own food and such. And all these energy slaves that we've had, in some of the rich countries, it's over 20, even 40, depending on the person, energy slaves working for them. Because a young, strong man can only do 1/8 of a horsepower of work at a time. So, and people have cars that are over 200 horsepower. So, and trucks and such that are 300 horsepower are common. You see them on the road all the time. So, he has his philosophy. I like it a lot. He has a good bibliography of books that he's read and gives you the names and the authors. So if you are interested, he has an appendix, Being a Physicist, where he has some graphs and some basic math, and gives some thought experiments that backs up what he says, and everything is rational and reasonable, and it's well footnoted as well. So, and his writing and prose, his grammar, his organized thinking, his logical, reasonable cause and effect, logic chain thinking is a real pleasure to read. He's good at it, at writing. Of the scientists, authors that I've read, he's about the best I've ever read in his command of the English language, knowing how to punctuate a sentence. A sentence should be a thought, and one thought ought to logically connect to the next thought. And he's a very talented, brilliant man. And I enjoyed his book and recommend it. And although it probably will go into that mechanical clerical class that H.G. Wells saw emerging at the end of the 1800s as a powerful force in the world, and he is kind of a champion of that mechanical, family-oriented way of thinking. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day. And it's also a reasonably priced book. I'd recommend you go out and buy it. Thank you. Bye-bye.